when a nation invades another, the invading nation usually has an optimistic projection of a quick turnaround and a decisive victory in a short amount of time. But when that doesn't happen, the war usually prolongs indefinitely to a point where both sides start exhausting their resources, ultimately ending in a stalemate. This is what happened in Korea in 1953 and may happen in Ukraine at some point in time. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about one of the longest, deadliest, yet indecisive wars in the Middle East, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980. Though there was historical animosity between the nations of Iran and Iraq for a long time, but the roots of the conflict can be traced in the 1975 Algiers Agreement between the two nations. The Algiers Agreement of 1975 reduced Iraqi control over the waterway of Shatt al-Arab in exchange for Iran withdrawing support for a Kurdish insurgency in northern Iraq. Now, the Shatt al-Arab waterway was important for Iraq because it was its only access into the Persian Gulf. So with this agreement, Iraq was allowed access to this waterway only up to the border with Iran. Beyond that, Iran had access to it all the way into the Persian Gulf. Now, fast forward to 1978-79, a turning point occurred in the relationship between the two countries because of the Iranian Revolution, in which the pro-Western government of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Iran was toppled by the Muslim cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Now, in parallel, Saddam Hussein became the president of Iraq and the leader of the country's Ba'ath Party in July of 1979. And with the regime change in Iran, Saddam Hussein became aware that the military in Iran had been significantly weakened in wake of the revolution. So the opportunity was ripe for Iraq to invade Iran and gain access over both sides of the Shatt al-Arab so it could have a direct entry point into the Persian Gulf. But besides access to the Shatt al-Arab waterway, Saddam Hussein also wanted to assert his authority in the region. Since he had newly taken over the reins of Iraq, nothing pleases a dictator more than extending their country's boundaries after turning out victorious in a war. And interestingly, Saddam Hussein's inspiration was Israel and its victory during the Six-Day War of 1967. So Saddam Hussein felt that if he could destroy the Iranian Air Force, just like Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on day one of the Six-Day War, he could pretty much come out victorious within a 5-day period. Yeah, he was thinking of outdoing Israel by a day. So on September 22, 1980, formations of Iraqi MiG-23s and MiG-21s attacked Iran's air bases near Tehran and 8 other air bases across the country. Their aim was to destroy the Iranian Air Force on the ground itself, taking a page from the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. Well, Iraq did succeed in destroying the runaways, fuel, and ammunition depots, but much of Iran's aircraft were left intact. And that is because most of the Iranian aircraft were lying protected in hangars, and also the Iranian runways were massive. So the bombing did not totally incapacitate Iran's large airfields, and within hours, Iranian F-4 Phantoms took off from the same bases, successfully attacked strategically important targets close to major Iraqi cities, and returned home with very few losses. Wait, so the Iraqis had MiGs and the Iranians had the F-4 Phantoms? Yep. Remember, prior to the Iranian Revolution, Iran was a US ally, so a lot of its military equipment was supplied by the US. Iraq, on the other hand, was a Soviet ally, and most of its military equipment was supplied by the Soviet Union. While the ground forces of Iraq were active on several fronts, the main thrust of the attack was in the south, where 5 armored and mechanized divisions invaded the province of Khuzestan on 2 axes, one crossing over the Shatt al-Arab near Basra, which led to the siege and eventual occupation of Khorramshahr, and the second heading for Sosangard, which had Ahvaz, the major military base in Khuzestan, as its objective. And within the first few days itself, the Iraqis had penetrated about 80 kilometers into the Iranian territory. And with these blitz-like assaults, many observers felt that Baghdad would win the war within a matter of weeks. Now, one of the reasons that Saddam Hussein was confident of victory over Iran was that after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, a lot of the military personnel had been disbanded because they were supposedly loyal to the Shah. But the perception was a little more exaggerated than the reality. A lot of the leadership had been disbanded, whereas the core personnel were still intact. Also, Ayatollah Khomeini had established the IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to unify and organize paramilitary forces that were committed to the revolution. And this force was supposed to serve as a counterweight to the regular army. And the reason why this is important is that Iran was able to prevent a quick Iraqi victory by a rapid mobilization of volunteers and a quick deployment of the IRGC. Another miscalculation of Saddam Hussein was that the 3 million Arabs of Khuzestan would join the Iraqis against Tehran. But the Arabs in the province of Khuzestan maintained their loyalty to Iran and continued to fight the Iraqi forces. The first president of Iran after the Iranian Revolution was Bani Sadr, and he was ousted in June of 1981. And after that, Ayatollah Khomeini was able to get the army and the IRGC to work in tandem, and that led to Iran gaining its first major victory in the war around September of 1981, when the army and the IRGC was able to force Baghdad to lift its long siege of Abadan. And this was followed by Iranian forces defeating Iraq in the Qasr-e-Shirin area in December of 1981 and January 1982. The other advantage that Iran had was its air force. Since it had the more superior American air power, the Iranian airplanes could carry 2 or 3 times more bombs or rockets than their Iraqi counterparts. And the Iranians were also able to use 2 or 3 groups of low-flying F-4s to hit targets almost anywhere in Iraq. As the war moved into 1982, Iran slowly started eating into the gains that Iraq had made in the last 2 years. And in May of 1982, Iranian units regained Khorramshahr, though with very high casualties. And post this victory, the Iranian forces continued to maintain pressure on the remaining Iraqi forces. And right around this time, Saddam Hussein put forth a proposal for peace. Wait, the aggressor suddenly wanted peace? Yes, and there are a few reasons that are often cited to explain Saddam Hussein's sudden quest for peace. One of them is that he probably realized that the war was headed to a stalemate, so it was better to end up with an image of the peace negotiator. The other reason could also be that he noticed that Iran was getting support from Libya and Syria, and Saddam Hussein wanted to be acknowledged as the leader of that region. So ending the war probably would bring all the regional players to a neutral disposition, and he could later on assert his leadership. But whatever be the reasons, Tehran rejected it outright, saying that it would not end the war till Saddam Hussein was out of office. And with that declaration, Iran became the aggressor. In July of 1982, Iran launched Operation Ramadan on Iraqi territory near Basra. Basra was within the range of Iranian artillery, but Iran indulged in human wave attacks, meaning sending legions of poorly equipped soldiers into the mechanized artillery of the enemy. So the aim is to overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers, even though the casualties are going to skyrocket. And Iran was not the first to do so. Soviet Union had done that in the Battle of Stalingrad during World War II, so had Japan. This wave of poorly equipped soldiers ranged in age from 9 to more than 50, but they were able to sweep over minefields and fortifications to clear the path for the Iranian tanks. And as one would guess, the casualty was very high. But Iran was able to capture some of the territory and gain an upper hand in the conflict. And this troubled Iraq, because Iran was using its strength in numbers to overpower Iraq, and Iraq didn't have the numbers to counter it. So what did Iraq do? It started with using tear gas to scare away the humans behind the human wave attacks. The Iranian forces thought that the gas was a poisonous gas, so they fled the area. Now, tear gas is not lethal, and it has only a temporary effect on the victims. But it gave Iraqi officers an insight into how chemical weapons could be used against Iran. And even though Iraq was a signatory to the Geneva Protocol, it realized the advantage it would get by use of chemical weapons. And by November of 1983, the first reports of Iraq's use of chemical weapons came in to the United Nations. The chemical weapons constituted the nerve agents taboon, sarin, and mustard gas. In August of 1983, these weapons were employed on the Piran-Shahar and Haji Omaran battlefields, and in November of 1983, they were used on the Panjwin battlefield. But it was only in March of 1986 that the then UN Secretary General, Javier Perez de Cuellar, formally accused Iraq of using chemical weapons against Iran. He cited the report of 4 chemical warfare experts whom the UN had sent to Iran in February and March of 1986, and the Secretary General called upon Baghdad to end the violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol on the use of chemical weapons. Meanwhile, by 1984, it was reported that some 300,000 Iranian soldiers and 250,000 Iraqi troops had been killed or wounded. And many military analysts felt that neither Iraq nor Iran had used its modern equipment efficiently. For example, tanks and armored vehicles were dug in and used as artillery pieces instead of being maneuvered to lead or to support an assault. And the main reason for this was the poorly trained commissioned officers and field commanders on both sides. Though Iraq was a Soviet ally, the United States too was backing it to some extent because it didn't want the spread of Iranian fundamentalism across the Middle East. But by and large, the superpowers did not participate too actively in the conflict and stayed at the level of supporting one versus the other. And then, in March of 1984, Iraq fired a Exocet missile at a Greek tanker south of Kark Island. And all of a sudden, neutral merchant ships in that region became targets of Iraqi long-range missiles. Iraq's objective, though, was to break the stalemate by cutting off Iran's oil exports so it could force Iran to the negotiating table. Far from coming to the negotiating table, Iran reciprocated in full measure. In April of 1984, Tehran launched its first attack against civilian commercial shipping by shelling an Indian freighter, and it followed it up with an attack on a Kuwaiti oil tanker near Bahrain on May 13th, and then a Saudi tanker in Saudi waters 5 days later. Essentially, it was also sending a message to Iraq that if Iraq continued to interfere with Iran's shipping, no Persian Gulf state would be safe. Now, at that time, about 40% of world's oil passed through the Persian Gulf area called the Strait of Hormuz. And so the attack on oil tankers started to pose a serious threat to the global oil supply. And because of that, the world started becoming concerned about this new development. So in 1987, the US launched Operation Earnest Will, one of the largest naval operations since the World War II. The goal was to protect the supply of oil moving through the Persian Gulf. And to accomplish that, the US Navy put US flags on Kuwaiti tankers to deter Iran from continuing its attacks. So a sort of a convoy system was developed where the US would pick up the Kuwaiti tankers outside the entrance to the Persian Gulf and escort them for a day or two until they reached Kuwait. With the US now in the Persian Gulf in full battle gear, it was only a matter of time before an international explosive situation would happen. And it happened on July the 3rd, 1988. A Pakistani tanker came under attack in the Persian Gulf, and the USS Vincennes, which was the US Navy's guided missile cruiser in that region, sent its helicopter to investigate. The Iranian ships fired warning shots at the helicopter, and the USS Vincennes moved to come to its aid, and in doing so, moved into the Iranian territorial waters, which was a clear violation of the rules of engagement. And around the same time this was happening, Iran Air Flight 655 took off from the nearby Bandar Abbas airport, headed to Dubai. And as it flew over this conflict zone, the crew of the USS Vincennes thought that it was a F-4 Iranian fighter aircraft. And when they tried to communicate with it, they did not get any response because the plane was a civilian airliner and it wasn't on the military frequency. So after numerous attempts of trying to communicate with it, the USS Vincennes shot 2 surface-to-air missiles in the direction of the airliner. Iran Air Flight 655 exploded, killing all 290 civilians on board. With this incident and several other reverses in the battles with Iraq, Iran finally reached a level of fatigue with the war. Actually, in July of 1987, the UN Security Council had unanimously passed Resolution 598, which urged Iraq and Iran to accept a ceasefire, withdraw their forces to internationally recognized boundaries, and settle their disputes by negotiations. And with the situation in the Persian Gulf becoming more explosive, and Iran not seeing much headway in its battle against Iraq, finally entered battle fatigue and decided to accept the UN resolution. Iraq agreed, and the war finally ended on August 20, 1988. Total casualty figures were estimated at between 1 to 2 million. There are three main lessons that can be learnt from the Iran-Iraq war. Number one, do not enter a war just on the basis of the best case scenario. Number two, once a war prolongs beyond the first few weeks, chances of a stalemate become higher. And number three, once other players start joining the conflict, things will get out of control. And I would like to end this section with a quote from Niccolo Machiavelli. Wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you please. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which US presidential candidate was once the prime accused in the Keating 5 scandal of 1989? 5 US senators were accused of improperly intervening in 1987 on behalf of Charles H. Keating Jr., who was the chairman of the Lincoln Savings and Loan Association. And Lincoln Savings and Loan Association was the target of a regulatory investigation at that time. And the 5 senators involved in the Keating affair were Senators John McCain, Alan Cranston, Donald W. Regal Jr., John Glenn, and Dennis D. Concini. So the answer is A, John McCain. Question for the current episode. In May of 1989, Iran filed a lawsuit against the United States at the International Court of Justice for the shooting down of Iran Air Flight 655. What was the final outcome of this lawsuit? Was it A, Iran was asked to apologize for prolonging the war that created the circumstances for this incident? B, the lawsuit was rejected by the International Court of Justice? C, the US agreed to pay about $62 million to the victims' families? Or D, the commander of USS Vincennes was court-martialed? Once again, in May of 1989, Iran filed a lawsuit against the United States at the International Court of Justice for the shooting down of Iran Air 655. What was the final outcome of this lawsuit? A, Iran was asked to apologize for prolonging the war that created the circumstances for this incident. B, the lawsuit was rejected by the International Court of Justice. C, the US agreed to pay about $62 million to the victims' families. Or D, the commander of USS Vincennes was court-martialed. The answer will be provided in the next episode. And that's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we look at some of the modern engineering marvels across the globe, their history, and what makes them an engineering marvel. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.